Hello, this is Hit Pause, a podcast made in San Francisco with more questions than answers.
And welcome back to Hit Pause, episode 2. Today we're in conversation with Reza Malekzadeh, a friend of mine, a brilliant entrepreneur, now venture capitalist. Good evening to you, Reza. You're in Paris.
Good evening, Hervé. Well, good morning to you. You're in San Francisco.
Indeed. So we're discussing today a little bit about entrepreneurship, but mostly from the angle of the entrepreneur, what drives an entrepreneur through the personal story. First, I'll introduce you a little bit to our audience. You've been an entrepreneur for all your life, really, starting in France, then working on a lot of projects over there, coming to the US. You've seen both sides of a culture, and I should say a third culture as well. You'll tell us a little bit about your history as well. For our audience, Reza has with him and behind him a long list of successful companies that he drove to acquisition. Netcarta, VMware. A lot of you in the industry know VMware, one of the leading software cloud companies out there that makes possible cloud computing. Twingo Systems that is sold to Cisco, Unity, and then I'm going to let you develop all of this. And that all of this led you to, like we say, go into the dark side of the venture capital. So what was that story that brought you from creating, joining, seeing successful companies at the very, very beginning? How was it like?
It was great, Hervé. You know, I actually started my career with a failure. And that was actually a very forming time. When I first came to the US, I joined a company that was called Comvision. And Comvision was the typical venture-backed company with a lot of technology, really cool product, but way ahead of its time. The timing was very wrong, and the company actually had to close and shut down only a few months after I had come over. And this failure actually was my first experience with Silicon Valley and got me to knowing the environment as one where it's actually okay to fail. Like there's a lot to learn through that, and you're not burned for the rest of your career. And that was a very exciting first experience coming out of France, where I left a society where failure was not really a good thing or an option. And it got me into the movements of Silicon Valley and discovered that, well, despite that, very quickly I was able to find another job. And that one going pretty much the other way around, being acquired by Microsoft very quickly within a year in a successful way. So discovering the ups and downs of Silicon Valley early on was a very good motivator in understanding that it's okay to try things. It's okay to set on a new course. It's okay to go, to a new startup or start a project, because ultimately, whether you succeed or fail, you will have learned things along the way, and those things can help you for the next step in your career.
Do you think fascinating this question of the approval to fail or the ability to fail comes time and time again. Each time there's a delegation of French public officials or large technology companies coming to the Valley to seek advice or see what's going on. Do you think France has changed, by the way, these days about this rapport to failure and that it's okay to fail now? Or is it changing slowly or not at all?
I think it's changing. When we were in school, if you remember, there was this law where if you actually started a company and failed, you had real banking problems as a personal individual because you were held responsible for that. And that law has actually been taken away. And so that was a sign of things slowly changing. And when you see today the number of young graduates who take the entrepreneurship route instead of going to the large companies, it's telling you that France is changing towards the right direction.
That's good. I remember when I was a young entrepreneur and manager in the Silicon Valley, about 25, 28 years old, 20 years ago. Yes, I could see, and I was seeing a lot of the young French entrepreneurs come to the Silicon Valley precisely at the time because they could not find a fostering environment with the entrepreneurship spirit. And now maybe less so. It's less obvious to me. Maybe I'm a little out of those channels, but it's good to hear that you're seeing slow progress, because ultimately good progress is always slow instead of big disruptions. So was there, after that failure, one, by comparison, to go to the other side, one company that was a huge success, and what are the lessons that you draw on the differences between the two of them?
So, I think I was very lucky to be part of the VMware adventure. As you mentioned, when I joined the company, there were actually 10 people in the whole organization, and I left at about 6,500. And we went through an acquisition in a very nice way by EMC. And then later on, we actually were publicly listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And so VMware was a great case of learning for me in terms of, a successful company going through scale and demonstrating the importance of execution beyond a good idea. Actually, very interestingly, that very first company that failed, one of its value propositions was to combine multiple pieces of hardware in one. So you would consolidate multiple servers in one server. And fast forward, several years later, VMware was roughly the same idea as a first value proposition. It was about server consolidation in a software way without hardware. And so, but the timing was different. The approach was different. The team's ability to execute was very different. And that made a huge difference, and the company was very technology oriented, had a lot of intellectual property. And one of the things that was also very interesting to me is in the very early days, VMware actually had a hard time convincing people of its vision. It had a hard time raising money because people thought, this is crazy. Like, who would want this thing? Why do you need this thing? Computers are cheaper and cheaper. Why do you need to have virtualization? And the founders stuck to their vision, and we continued to execute, and little by little prove the value of what we had in mind, and demonstrate the value of the vision, to the point where, as you mentioned, VMware's virtualization technology was a huge enabler of the cloud. And so I learned the notion of sticking to a vision, focusing on execution, and really also focusing on hiring an amazing team. One of the key lessons I learned from our CEO, Diane, was it's better not to hire for a role than to hire the wrong person. And so we were continuously understaffed, continuously trying to bring the best folks around. And that actually helped really build the company, even though it was kind of hard in the early days because you were often under-resourced and had to struggle to get things done.
There's lots to unpack here. And as I listen to you, a couple of thoughts come to mind. The first one is that in the triangle of success, if you will, technology only plays one role. And too often people who will read the Silicon Valley from afar think that that's the only thing that makes it successful, where in fact you're hinting at that timing of market and cost equation resolution is important, and the human factor is just as important, right?
Right. Yeah.
One of the things that is intriguing in what you say when you look at the success factors as well is this resistance to new idea, to thinking differently. Talk to me a little bit about the resistance, because you've been in multiple companies. You are yourself seeing lots of visions of young entrepreneurs coming to you, young or older entrepreneurs coming to you. What is it in the human psyche that develops blind spots to the point where people say, I don't believe in the vision of the cloud and virtualization. You guys are crazy. This is a very strong word to use.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think it's a notion of, comfort zone. People are comfortable in what they do, what they know. And when you come and try to disrupt that, you're fundamentally not just introducing new technology, you also are impacting the way they work. And very often, you'll find that the human equation, even on the customer end, is harder than the pure technology equation. Like you can come and demonstrate that your technology works, that it's solid, but you are impacting the way that organization was set up, the way people worked, the way people interacted with each other. And so that, has an impact. Think of it, before virtualization, in an organization, if you wanted a new piece of hardware or server, someone had to write up a procurement sheet. It had to go be acquired. You had to receive the physical server. Someone had to unpack it, put it in racks. And that whole process was now transformed to an admin in the system going to a web interface and basically giving you access to a virtual machine. So in a way, you actually took away from the work or the power of some people in procurement. You took away from the work or power of some people who had to go and, wire the servers. And I think then those people come to resist. Instead of trying to think about how it can actually improve their work, well, instead of pulling cables, you're not going to be able to spend your time doing more interesting things. Their first reaction is an adverse one. It's like, you're impacting me, so I'm going to basically say no before I do anything else.
Yeah, I'm equating this to this whole humongous evolution of the connected car experience, which is now in the field where I happen to work, is moving towards automation and autonomous driving. When you think about it, this technology revolution, because it is a revolution and or an evolution, maybe it's both, is basically forcing us to think that one day you enter into your car and the car is able to drive itself, all the way to having seen design concepts of cars that no longer have a steering wheel. And so there is a re-education of the entire behavior and relationship of the human trust to that connected car that forces an entire population of the world to rethink how they drive. So the human factor is just as important as the technology feast and accomplishment. So we're going to finish this first part of our little dialogue. What compelled you to then go to the dark side and turn into a venture capitalist?
Well, I kept being involved with young projects and entrepreneurs as I was evolving through my career. I was lucky to be asked to join some boards as an independent board member. I was asked and offered opportunities to be advisor to some younger entrepreneurs, and did some personal investments. And I took a liking in that. I took a liking in the fact that, hey, there's all these new things coming along, and I can bring some of my experience, and at least I can share some of the things I've learned. And ultimately they'll do what they want, but it's interesting to be able to influence some of that. So it's kind of a natural path. And being a VC today, offers me the opportunity to be involved with a variety of projects, a variety of entrepreneurs, and then share with them my experience, but also learn from them. And it's actually very humbling to learn about new technologies, new approaches from all this young crowd building companies. So I think it's super exciting, and as long as I keep learning, I'm happy.
Fantastic. We'll be learning about that in our third part of our conversation with Reza. For now, we're going to take a little break, reflect, and come back in a few seconds.
And now, let's go to a short break to hit pause, reflect, or just continue.
And welcome back to Hit Pause. We're in a conversation with Reza. We went through a little bit of your introduction, your career, your first observation, but I want to go back a little bit, back in time. In the first episode, I was talking about this novel human being that we all are at some point of time. a blank sheet of paper in which life imprints stories, adventures, emotions, sometimes good, hopefully, sometimes more difficult to look at. So tell us a little bit about what is so special about you, because I mentioned in the introduction that you really are multicultural. I talked about the French culture, the American culture, but there's also you're of Iranian born and descent. So what was the beginning of your life like, Reza?
Sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I was born in Iran and before the revolution, and we lived happily in Tehran until the revolution happened in 1979. And at that point, my parents at first stayed a little bit, um, wanting to understand or see what was going to happen. But then, as the events unfolded and the basically the Islamic regime was taking over, they decided this was not where they wanted to raise their kids, and so they packed their bags, my brother and me, and left Iran and came to France. And we ended up in France fundamentally because my dad was trained as an architect and loved Paris. And he never thought that the revolution would last long. So he thought, hey, we're going to be here maybe a year, and at least let's enjoy Paris, and then we'll go back home. Um, well, it never happened, right? The revolution lasted, and where we had left with just enough in our bags for a vacation, we ended up having to rebuild a life here in France. And I think we were very lucky that France welcomed us. We were very lucky that France has such a great education system that allowed us to go to school and to basically thrive as a result of it. But we came in a country where neither my parents, my brother, or myself spoke the language. So all four of us had to pretty much start from scratch. And I often try to reflect on, now that I have two kids, what would happen if I had to today pack my bags and move with them to a place where I didn't speak the language, and where I would not be allowed to actually do my job because my diploma would not be recognized. And it took me a while, and it obviously happened many years later, to realize actually what my parents went through, and then the decision and choice they made for us. And it's very, very humbling to think that they did it for us, and we basically would not be here if they had not made that choice.
Do you have memories as a child of dread, of fear, of suddenly the daunting magnitude of what was going on? Or was it more as a kid who's very pliable and changing? Was it just different? What can you remember of those times, emotions?
I think on the spot, as a kid, we didn't necessarily notice anything directly. We noticed that we had changed. We were not in the same place. We were surrounded by people that we could barely understand, and so you kind of feel a little bit, obviously as a stranger and kind of surrounded. But I think as a kid, in the early days, you tend to adjust pretty quickly. But as you grow up, there's this kind of back wave that hits you because you start realizing through your parents what it must have been and what it was. You start realizing that, wow, these things happened, and they shielded you as much as they could, but you couldn't fail to notice that, yeah, for a while, like, you didn't see anyone because the rest of your family was still in a different country. You couldn't travel. No one spoke the language at home. And you start realizing these later on, kind of the fact that you were not part of it, that you were kind of another part of society. You only realize that later, not on the spot.
It's a fascinating trait of the human psychology that I think is also there built in to shield us or to protect us. I really believe that once we're in the moment of a situation, the brain focuses on what's the immediacy of the situation to resolve at hand. And it's only after that we have, when we're back in the safety of the cave, and I'm using the term just to probably hint at the fact that this psychological reflex is built in since we were, as prehistorical men in the caves. Once you have to fight the the saber-tooth panther or tiger or whatever you have to fight out there, you just don't think, you just act instinctively. And then it's only after that that you tell the tale and that you paint the Lascaux paintings on the walls of the cave. And I think as well, when trauma happens or change happens as a kid, you don't have the intellectual or emotional tools that an adult may have to take some distance.
Yeah, you don't. But later on you realize, oh, wait, my friends are visiting their grandparents this weekend, but mine are super far. Or, they're going to their family house in this region of France, and wait, we don't really have an equivalent, nor do we have another region of France that we can, go to or belong to. And that's when little by little you realize this, but not at first. And I think it kind of hits you back as a back wave.
Do you think that this experience shaped or informed somehow your desire to then try new things, to go to new territories, to be adventurous and entrepreneur?
I think it helps to some extent, because fundamentally you have nothing to rely on or nothing to lose, right? It's you basically have been marching forward, and it's not like you can come back and say, well, oh, my uncle works for this company, he's going to find me an internship there. Or, my grandfather owns this thing and I'm going to go and work there. And you don't have any of the same, I would say, things that matter to you than probably my typical schoolmate. And so I think you're more able to just simply want to try things because you have nothing to lose fundamentally. And you have everything to gain to build by yourself. And that's one of the key lessons I think my parents tried to share with us, which was, other than a great education, we have nothing to offer you. So make the most of it, go to school, and you can only rely on yourself, because everything we have has been cut away and is left back in Iran. So now it's basically you and your ability to do something.
Wow, it's a fantastic and life lesson to reflect upon. I come back to one of the parties that we had at your house a couple of years ago, and we were both in a moment of that party where there was a moment of levity, like in French we say, there's an ange passe, an angel is passing, and I asked you a pointed question. I don't know if you remember it. And I asked you just like that, point blank, in the middle of a conversation that we had about human psychology, why are you so active? Why are you doing so much? Why are you an entrepreneur? Do you remember what you told me at that time?
I think you were talking about my fear of death.
Yes.
Yeah, and it continued to be true, and fundamentally this notion that you are transient, and that there's only a limited time you have on Earth, and whether there is something after or not, I don't know, but you fundamentally don't remember even if there were, so it doesn't really matter. And the desire to make the most of the time I have, and the desire to make the most of what I can. And not just sit it through.
That's a fascinating admission. So thank you for our auditors to go there with me. This is fundamental. That means that the engine of entrepreneurship, the engine of innovation, the engine of creation is something which is deeply, deeply rooted into the human psyche. So it must be the source of an immense source of energy and passion. And how many times have I heard or seen venture capitalists tell me that ultimately what they're seeking in an entrepreneur is the passion precisely for those moments when it's tough, precisely for those moments when everybody tells you no. Do you draw the same connection?
I think to a large part, yes. I'm a big believer that, ultimately in an entrepreneurial project, you can change your product, you can change your pricing, you can change your packaging, you can change your positioning. You can't change your people. and the resilience of the people is pretty critical. And one of the very important traits for me in an entrepreneur is someone who has the ability to get back up quickly if they fall down. And there is no smooth path to success, right? It's not a linear line that you can just say, I'm just going to do this and this and this, and just after that, I'm going to succeed. I think it's a lot of ups and downs, and the character, the ability to basically stomach the downs, get back up, and keep going is very, very critical. And that to me is probably the most important thing that I look for, especially when you invest at early stage where there's not much execution done to date, and there's still a lot of unknowns ahead of you.
Thank you, Reza. We're going to take a second pause, and we'll come back to explore and look forward, precisely rebounding on what you just said.
And now, let's go to a short break to hit pause, reflect, or just continue.
And welcome back to Hit Pause. So thank you, Reza. We just finished our second part talking a little bit about what's important in the environment of the... Hello, we can hear the French Parisian police or fire truck. You can see this is a very typical Parisian sound. We just talked about the entrepreneurship spirit. We just talked a little bit about what's important in this question of resilience that you talked about. Lots of young aspiring entrepreneurs, sometimes immature, sometimes just people having an idea, are at the beginning of their careers, and they will have an idea, they will have a technology, they will have a product, and they focus a lot on that, of course, and they should. But I want to explore in our third part together of our conversation, how does a venture capitalist like you, how does an entrepreneur, because you are and you always will remain an entrepreneur, how do you assess that human quality? How do you go to understanding the passion behind a human being that comes to you with a business plan, sometimes well developed, sometimes well chiseled, sometimes less so? What are the cues that you're reading inside an entrepreneur to precisely understand whether they have it in them to follow that passion and to follow even during the hard times?
It's a great question. I think for me, fundamentally, the business plan, the Excel spreadsheet, the cute slides is something that they're going to be able to do regardless. Actually, if they can't even get to that, then there's something missing in their business acumen. But beyond that, I think the most important thing to me is really the time you spend with them in interactions. Because when you present that to me, I'm going to ask you questions. The way you respond to criticism, the way you respond to me not agreeing with you necessarily, is going to say about your ability to listen, about your ability to interact, the way we can explore scenarios in different markets, or I may challenge you in your approach to a given market. All of this interaction tells you about the entrepreneur's ability to listen and push through with their idea, maybe hear out new ideas, and really show some of their character to you. I think that's very critical because no one knows everything from day one, and all of the large successes that you look at from Twitter to Facebook to Google, all of them changed things along the way. All of them started one thing, and then Facebook in the early days was not very much a fan of the mobile app, and Zuckerberg wanted some HTML5 application and not mobile native, and it took him a while to realize that was a mistake and completely change over. And so there's no perfect path, but I think it's critical to spend time with the entrepreneur and understand whether he or she has that ability to listen and interact. You see some people who are very much attached to only their view, are not willing to take any other opinion or criticism, and that's bad. I mean, I don't say that I know better than them, clearly not. I don't say that they're making a mistake in what they're saying, but along the way, there's going to be moments where they're going to need to reach out and listen. And I think that's pretty important to me, in understanding whether they can do that properly or not. So spending time with them, spending time in different environments, talking with people who have interacted with them, people who have either worked with them or coached them or taught them. All of those are very interesting points of human character that you cannot easily put in a spreadsheet, and things that you really need to pursue.
Is that why, let's forget for the moment the entrepreneur who comes with an idea or a technology where there's a clear mismatch, or the business planning is not well done, or you have eliminated them on that basis. But is this why there is a fairly long period when you have a potential investee or a potential success there, that it still takes time to get to that moment where you negotiate the term sheet and the funding happens? In other terms, is this why it takes a long time to raise money?
I think to some extent, yes. And actually the negotiation of the term sheet is very telling. The fact that, you're going to negotiate and you're going to see how do they react to the points you bring up. What do they actually listen now to arguments? How do they counter those? All of those are super important. For me, once you have done the deal, is actually the start of a very long journey. If you look at typical VC environments from the early stage, you can be invested in a company for up to 10 years. It's basically the average length of a marriage today. So in a way, you have to make sure that you're going to be able to interact with them. And as long as everything is fine, there's usually no problem. But when there is a problem, when something goes wrong, is when they're going to need your help or reach out to you or reach out to the others. And you have to be sure that you will be able to communicate with them well, and they're going to be able to understand that we're all on the same team. And those aspects are not things that you can find in a spreadsheet. At least from my point of view, those are things that you can only figure out by spending time with folks, with talking with them, and understanding how they see things.
So that means that venture capital is really a people's business, less a technology business, really.
To me, it is. I really believe it's a human business. I think it's a very important human business.
Do you think that there were ages in the Silicon Valley about venture capital or the venture capital industry at large? Because I remember having talked to some of the venture capitalists of the early funds when few people even knew what venture capital was at the time when the semiconductor industry was born. Even the early stages of Sequoia Capital, when nobody knew who they were, there was this first wave of true entrepreneurs who had actually come out of semiconductor industry, who had put their own money, who were truly entrepreneurs themselves. Then I heard the story that there was a venture capital burgeoning as an industry where managers of financial investments came on board, and it became more of a suit business. Maybe this is iconoclast to say it that way. And do you think we're going back to an age of entrepreneur being a venture capitalist because of the microfunds, because of angel funding? Are there ages, in other terms, in venture capital?
Yeah, there are ages in that there's been evolution for sure. I mean, if you look at you look at the Silicon Valley venture capitalists, but look at the European ones. The first ones were all basically a branch of a bank, right? They were basically financiers who, came from financial institutions who had decided to try to replicate a little bit what Silicon Valley had. And now you have a second wave of funds over the past few years here in Europe, where most of the partners have an entrepreneurial background. And I think that's pretty important. It's not just about the money. In a way, there's a caricatural thing that says, money is fundamentally easy to find, but you're going to spend time with people. How can the venture capitalists sit at the board of a company and try to counsel the entrepreneur if they've never worked themselves in a company and have only been dealing with spreadsheets their whole life? It becomes very theoretical. And I think the entrepreneur, when something goes wrong, he or she needs to have practical counseling, practical experience shared with them. And that's where you get back to the human aspect. Like, I can tell you what I lived through, then you can learn the lessons of it. But if I'm only going to open a book of theories and throw that at you, well, why do you need me? You might as well just go and buy a book yourself.
Yeah. Do you think that this European venture capitalism is different than the one in the Silicon Valley because the humans are slightly different? They're coming from different culture. And God knows, you and I know, and some of our auditors know that in Europe, you also have multiple cultures. You have the Latins, you have the Nordics, you have the in-between, the more balanced Anglo-Saxons. Do you think the European venture capitalist has a different human profile?
I think it's slightly different, but all the folks that I've met with, because there is that same kind of attraction to technology, it actually makes you much closer than you would think. The Swedish VC and the British VC and the French VC are going to be closer than probably your average Swede, your average Briton, and your average French guy. Because the technology unites you, and those technology companies go beyond borders. If you start a company in Switzerland in enterprise software, clearly that local market is not going to be enough for you. And so you're going to seek out to go beyond it. So you have to be much more open culturally than the typical person. So I think that gets people closer. Now, with that said, I think in general, because of the European background, folks are probably a little bit more fiscally responsible than in the US. They tend to build companies in a leaner way than the average Silicon Valley folks will do. There's much less of this notion of, oh, there's plenty of money, let's just go and burn it all and see what happens. There is still a remainder of European conservatism in that, from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. It's a question of risk, right? What is the tolerance for risk, and at which price do you pay? Or do you get risk valued at? Sometimes I have observed as well that, in fact, there is maybe an evolution, you tell me, in a venture capitalist, also for the entrepreneur, I should verbalize it this way, understanding the class of venture capitalists that they are facing. Do they face someone who's very, very risk-taking, maybe an angel investor, when there's not much, maybe not even a product, just an idea or the seed of a prototype or a demonstrator? It's a very different conversation than if you have a full-fledged product and you're starting to raise your first Series A round. Do you think that the dynamics of risk aversion change, and that an entrepreneur needs to think about the ages of the risk profile in their company?
I think they do. I think that as you build the company, clearly the more progress you make, the less risk there is. The profile of the people who are going to fund you are going to be very different. What they expect as a return is going to be different. And the interesting thing is, you see more and more, at least in Europe, this notion of, ex-entrepreneurs who were successful who become angel investors, which you had for a long time in Silicon Valley. And so that actually brings folks who are much more risk favorable in the very early days, and makes the early stage funding easier and more Silicon Valley-like. And then as the company grows, they're going to be able to find money that is probably more risk averse. And now more and more American funds are coming to try to invest in Europe with their risk profile. So that's shaking up a little bit the European scene.
Interesting new development. It's always dynamic. So we'll finish with maybe one last comment or advice. So we talked about the human psyche. We talked about the emotional story of an entrepreneur and what shapes their perception of the world and what they're trying to accomplish, and how you as an investor, or the investor across the table, tries to read them as a human being beyond everything else and beyond the Excel spreadsheet. For a first-time entrepreneur who has an idea, who has how do you break the logjam of not having much of a history of serial entrepreneurship? What's your advice to someone who's starting with a blank sheet of paper in the entrepreneurship world?
Go out and talk about your project, sell it. An entrepreneur is an everyday salesperson. They need to be continuously selling their project. They need to actually start by selling it to themselves, sell it to the people around them, and that's the only way to go about it, in my view. And that's one big difference, by the way, that I had noticed earlier on in between Europe and the US. Everywhere you went to, every social event in Silicon Valley, there's always an entrepreneur trying to sell you on what they're doing. Like, I'm doing this. This is great. This is amazing. Whereas in Europe, they didn't tend to talk too much about it. This fear that, oh, someone's going to steal my idea. And you learn very quickly in Silicon Valley that execution beats strategy. And so I really like this notion of the hungry entrepreneur who basically goes out and continuously tries to sell their project to everyone, because they need to surround themselves by people who believe in them. Not everyone's going to fund it, obviously, but they're going to keep going from group to group. And if along the way they've been able to evangelize their idea, then they're going to be much more successful at trying to develop it later on.
All right, wise words from Reza Malekzadeh. Maybe I'll have to title this episode "Building and Selling to Defeat Death." How about that?
That's a great title.
Reza, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hervé.
To you. We look forward maybe to having you in one of the other seasons of Hit Pause. With that, we're leaving you, me from California and Reza from Paris.
Goodbye.
Au revoir.
This podcast is a simple way of sharing my thoughts. It is a personal endeavor, nothing more. A way to connect. The views and opinions represented in this podcast are solely mine. They are in no way, nor should they be assumed to be shared, supported, endorsed by my employer, the sponsors of this show, Anchor.fm, where it is hosted, and all the distributors thereof. You may find more information, links, pictures, videos, documents, and more, which may have been referenced in this podcast, on my website at www.uteza.com/podcast. There, it feels so much better after saying all of this. And so, it's time to part ways, at least for now. Until next time, time to say goodnight, time to hit pause.